The July sun beat down on the Texas prairie with the kind of heat that could kill a woman who didn't know any better. Margaret Brennan stood alone on the dusty road outside El Paso, watching the mail coach disappear into the shimmering distance, taking with it her last connection to civilization, and leaving behind only her trunk and carpetbag in the red dirt. She had exactly 43 cents in her reticule. She knew the precise amount because she had counted it 17 times during the journey from Boston, each count confirming what she already knew. 43 cents was not enough to buy passage back east. It was not enough to secure lodging for more than a single night. It was not enough to purchase hope. The driver had demanded an additional $5 to continue the final 30 miles to Red River County. When she could not produce the money, he had simply stopped. The coach unloaded her belongings with mechanical efficiency and driven away without a backward glance. His last words still echoed in the heat. "A woman without money has no right to ride in my coach." Margaret was 27 years old, and until 3 months ago she had believed herself competent and capable. She had worked as an accounting clerk at Henderson Textile Manufacturing in Boston for 6 years, managing ledgers for a company that employed over 200 workers. She could track inventory across 4 warehouses, reconcile accounts to the penny, and identify discrepancies that eluded men with twice her experience and 3 times her salary. None of that mattered now. Henderson Textile had closed in March, another victim of the economic panic that had swept through the industrial Northeast like a plague. 43 employees dismissed in a single afternoon, their expertise rendered worthless by forces beyond their control. Margaret had stood in the factory office that last day, watching skilled workers file out with their few personal possessions in hand, and realized with cold clarity that her competence meant nothing if no one would pay for it. She had held on for 2 months, burning through her meager savings while searching for another position. But Boston had no use for unemployed accounting clerks when hundreds of men with families to support competed for every available job. Her landlady had given her 2 weeks' notice when the rent came due for the 3rd consecutive month without payment. That was when she had answered the advertisement, "Mail order bride wanted for prosperous ranch owner in Red River County, Texas. Correspondents welcome. Must be of good character and willing to embrace frontier life." Daniel Thorne had written back within 2 weeks. His letters arrived with encouraging regularity over the next 18 months, each one painting a picture of life on the T-Bar Ranch. 3,000 acres of good grazing land, 500 head of cattle, a substantial house with proper windows and a stone fireplace. A man of 42 who had built his ranch from nothing and now sought a partner to share his success. The letters had been carefully written, almost formal in their correctness, but they contained enough detail to seem authentic. He described the landscape, the challenges of ranching, the isolation of frontier life. He never made extravagant promises or flowery declarations. The correspondence felt honest, practical, real. She had sold everything. Her mother's silver pocket watch traded to a pawnbroker for $8. The set of bone china her grandmother had brought from Ireland, which fetched $12 from a dealer on Hanover Street. 6 accounting ledgers from her years at Henderson Textile, purchased for 50 cents by a young clerk who thought they might prove useful for study. The money had paid for her passage west and left her with those 43 cents that now constituted her entire fortune. Margaret picked up her carpetbag with one hand, gripped the handle of her trunk with the other, and began walking. The mail coach had deposited her perhaps 5 miles from her destination. She had walked farther than that on her daily route to the textile factory. The heat was brutal and the dust choked her throat, but she had not come 2,000 miles to surrender now. She walked for 3 hours. The sun moved across the sky with pitiless indifference. The road stretched ahead in a straight line that seemed to extend to infinity. Twice she stopped to rest in the minimal shade of scraggly mesquite trees, but she did not allow herself to sit for long. Movement was purpose, and purpose was the only thing keeping despair at bay. When she finally saw the buildings in the distance, her first thought was that she had somehow taken a wrong turn. The mail coach driver had given her simple directions. Follow the road north to the T-Bar Ranch. You cannot miss it. But what she saw ahead looked nothing like the prosperous operation Daniel Thorne had described in his letters. The main house was partially collapsed on one side, its roof sagging inward like a broken promise. The barn stood open to the elements, its large doors hanging crookedly on rusted hinges. Corral fencing lay scattered in sections, some posts still upright, others fallen and half buried in drifted sand. The whole place had the look of abandonment, as if life had packed up and moved on to more promising ground. A man was working with horses in what remained of the largest corral. Even at a distance, Margaret could see his competence. He moved with the economy of motion that comes from years of practice, his body anticipating the animal's movements before they happened. A rope spun in a lazy circle at his side, then flicked out with sudden precision to settle around the neck of a young sorrel mare. The horse pulled back, testing the constraint, but the man held firm, speaking words Margaret could not hear, but whose calming tone carried across the distance. She set down her trunk and walked toward the corral, her carpetbag still in hand. The man glanced up as she approached, his expression moving from mild curiosity to something that might have been sympathy, tinged with resignation. He was tall and lean in the way of men who did hard physical work without enough to eat. His face was weathered to the color of old leather, with lines around his eyes that suggested either frequent smiling or constant squinting against the sun. Margaret could not yet tell which. He wore a battered hat, pulled low work clothes that had been mended more than once, and boots scuffed to gray. "Help you, ma'am," he said. His voice was deep and rough, as if he did not use it often enough to keep it smooth. Margaret straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin, summoning the dignity she had maintained through every humiliation of the past 3 months. "I am looking for Daniel Thorne. I was told this is the T-Bar Ranch." The man removed his hat, revealing dark hair streaked with premature gray. He studied her with eyes the color of creek water, and in that moment she saw understanding dawn in his expression. He had seen women like her before. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "there is no Daniel Thorne. Never has been, far as I know." The words hit her like physical blows, but Margaret had learned not to show weakness. Her hands tightened on her carpetbag until her knuckles whitened, but her voice remained steady. "Then who are you, Luke Garrett? I work this place, or what remains of it." She gestured toward the ruined buildings, the scattered fence posts, the general air of defeat. "And what remains of it is this." Luke Garrett nodded slowly. "T-Bar Ranch went bankrupt 8 months ago. Owner was Marcus Thornton. He died of a heart attack, left the place drowning in debt. Bank owns it now. I stayed on to care for what livestock survived. 80 horses, 40 head of cattle. Not enough to make the place profitable, but enough to need looking after." Margaret felt the ground shift beneath her feet, that same sensation of falling she had experienced when the factory foreman announced Henderson Textile was closing. The same cold clarity descended. She had been deceived. Whoever Daniel Thorne was, he had never owned this ranch. He had probably never set foot in Texas. He had spun stories in carefully written letters, collected whatever money she had sent for wedding preparations, and disappeared into whatever anonymous city spawned such predators. She had sent him $60 over the course of their correspondence. $60 she could not afford, sent in good faith for expenses he claimed to be incurring on her behalf. New furniture for the house, supplies for a proper wedding, feed for the horses through a hard winter. All lies. "How much does the bank want for this place?" she heard herself ask. Luke Garrett's expression shifted to surprise. "You thinking of buying a bankrupt ranch?" "Ma'am." "I am thinking," she said with more confidence than she felt, "that I need to know the specific numbers involved. $2,400. That was the outstanding debt when Marcus died. The land alone is worth twice that if the place was functional, but nobody wants to buy a ranch they would have to rebuild from scratch." Margaret looked around at the collapsed structures, the scattered equipment, the general disrepair. In her mind she was already calculating land value versus debt load, current income capacity versus potential, risk versus alternative options. Her alternative options consisted of those 43 cents and no prospects. She turned back to Luke Garrett, who was watching her with an expression of cautious curiosity. "Do you have somewhere I could stay tonight? I can pay." Her hand moved toward her reticule, though she knew the money inside would not buy much. Luke shook his head. "Keep your money, ma'am. Bunkhouse is empty. You are welcome to it for the night. Tomorrow I can take you into Red River Town. There is a boarding house there, and the mail coach comes through twice weekly if you are wanting to head back east. She heard the kindness in his offer and the assumption beneath it. He expected her to leave. They always did, she imagined. The disappointed mail-order brides, the failed homesteaders, the dreamers who discovered that Texas was harder than they had imagined. Margaret picked up her carpetbag again. "Thank you, Mr. Garrett. I accept your offer of lodging, but I will not be requiring transport to Red River Town tomorrow." Something that might have been respect flickered in his steady gaze. "Suit yourself, ma'am, but there is nothing here for you." She followed him across the dusty yard toward the bunkhouse, a long, low building with a sagging roof but solid walls. "Perhaps not," she said quietly, "but there is nothing anywhere else either." That night alone in the bunkhouse, with the Texas darkness pressing against the windows and the sound of horses moving in the corral outside, Margaret opened her carpetbag and removed the 6 accounting ledgers she had kept. They were the only items of value she still possessed, though their value was not monetary. She lit the kerosene lamp Luke Garrett had provided and spread the ledgers across the rough wooden table. Each one represented a year of her work at Henderson Textile. Revenue and expenditure columns marched down the pages in her precise handwriting. Inventory records tracked raw materials and finished goods. Payroll accounts documented wages paid to 200 employees across 4 years of operation. She had kept these ledgers not as souvenirs, but as evidence of competence. When she sought new employment in Boston, she had planned to show potential employers that she could manage complex accounts, that she understood the flow of money through a business, that she could identify problems before they became crises. Now sitting in a bunkhouse on a bankrupt ranch 2,000 miles from Boston, Margaret studied those ledgers with different eyes. She saw patterns. She understood what made a business succeed or fail. She knew how money moved and where it leaked away through carelessness or mismanagement. "If I could manage the accounts for a company with 200 employees, she thought, I can save a ranch with 1 man and 100 head of livestock." The idea was absurd. She knew nothing about ranching. She had never ridden a horse except for sedate outings in Boston Common. She could not tell good grazing land from poor. She did not know how to repair a fence or birth a calf or any of the 1,000 practical skills that frontier life required. But she knew numbers, and numbers did not lie. She closed the ledgers and blew out the lamp. Tomorrow she would make Luke Garrett an offer he would probably refuse. But she had not come 2,000 miles to give up at the first obstacle. She had been defeated by forces beyond her control too many times already. This time she would fight. Morning came with brutal brightness. Margaret woke to the sound of Luke Garrett working in the corral, his voice a low murmur as he spoke to the horses. She washed her face in cold water from the pump outside the bunkhouse, changed into her second dress, and walked across the yard to where he was forking hay into a feed trough. "Good morning, Mr. Garrett." He turned surprise evident on his weathered face. "Morning, ma'am. I will have the wagon ready in an hour if you are wanting that ride to town." Margaret shook her head. "I need to see the ranch accounts first." Luke Garrett set down the pitchfork and removed his hat, using it to wipe sweat from his forehead despite the early morning cool. "Ma'am, there are no accounts to speak of. Marcus kept some papers in the house, but he was not much for record-keeping." "Perfect," Margaret said. "May I see these papers?" Something in her tone must have convinced him she was serious. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Follow me." The main house was in worse condition inside than it appeared from without. The sagging roof had let in rain that had warped the floorboards and stained the walls with dark patches of mold. Furniture lay scattered and broken, but in what had been Marcus Thornton's office, a roll-top desk still stood against one wall, remarkably intact. Luke pulled open the desk to reveal a chaos of papers stuffed into cubbyholes and drawers without any apparent organization. Bills of sale receipts, contracts, promissory notes, all jumbled together in a mess that would have made Margaret's fastidious supervisor at Henderson Textile apoplectic. She spent 6 hours sorting through that desk while Luke Garrett worked outside. She spread papers across the dusty floor in organized stacks, income documents in one pile, expenses in another, debts owed to the ranch in a third, debts owed by the ranch in a fourth. The story those papers told was one of slow disintegration. Marcus Thornton had not been a bad man or even a particularly incompetent rancher, but he had been careless with money in the way of men who believe they can always earn more. He had bought supplies at whatever price was asked without shopping for better deals. He had sold livestock at the first offer without negotiating for higher prices. He had extended credit to neighbors who never paid and paid cash to suppliers who would have accepted credit. Most damaging, he had failed to collect debts owed to him. Margaret found 3 contracts for horses sold and delivered but never paid for. $740 that should have been in the ranch account but was instead sitting in the pockets of men who had simply never been pressed for payment. She found receipts showing Marcus had paid $320 too much for feed and supplies. Over the past 2 years, the result of poor arithmetic and vendors who charged more than they should. She found a grazing permit for federal land that Marcus had purchased but never used. 200 head of cattle could graze on that land for free, reducing feed costs significantly. When Luke Garrett came to check on her as the afternoon shadows lengthened, he found her sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by organized stacks representing order imposed on chaos, her face smudged with dust but her eyes bright with discovery. "Mr. Garrett," she said without preamble, "this ranch is not as bankrupt as you think." Luke leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. That's so. Marcus Thornton owed the bank $2,400. But people owe this ranch $740 for horses already delivered. He overpaid suppliers by at least $320 over 2 years' money that could be recovered through renegotiation, and there is a grazing permit worth $200 annually in reduced feed costs. She looked up at him, her accounting mind already running calculations. If we can collect even half the outstanding debts, renegotiate supplier contracts, and utilize the grazing permit, we can pay the bank $1,060 immediately. That would reduce the debt to $1,340. With proper management, the ranch can generate sufficient income to pay off the remainder within 18 months. Luke Garrett was silent for so long that Margaret wondered if she had miscalculated somewhere. But when he finally spoke, his tone was thoughtful rather than dismissive. "You figured all that out from Marcus's mess of papers." Margaret stood brushing dust from her skirt. "I worked as an accounting clerk in Boston for 6 years, Mr. Garrett. I managed ledgers for a company 10 times the size of this operation. Numbers do not lie. Marcus Thornton did not fail because the ranch was unprofitable. He failed because he did not manage his money properly." Luke walked into the room, picking up one of the contracts she had organized. "You said we, as in we can collect the debts." Margaret took a deep breath. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind while organizing papers, but actually saying the words felt like stepping off a cliff into empty air. "I propose a partnership, Mr. Garrett. Give me 90 days. I will collect the outstanding debts, renegotiate supplier contracts, and organize the ranch finances. In exchange, I stay here, learn how to work a ranch, and receive 20% of any profit we manage to generate. If at the end of 90 days the ranch is not in better financial condition, I will leave and you will owe me nothing." Luke set down the contract and studied her with his steady gray gaze. "What makes you think you can collect debts from Texas ranchers who have been ignoring Marcus's requests for months?" "Because I am not Marcus." Margaret met his gaze steadily. "I am a woman from Boston with accounting experience and nothing to lose. I will be professional, persistent, and precise. Men who ignore another rancher will be embarrassed to ignore a woman who presents them with documented proof of their debt." And the other skills, Luke gestured toward the window and the broken ranch beyond. "You do not know how to ride a horse, or mend a fence, or any of the 1,000 things that ranching requires. Then you will teach me." Margaret heard the determination in her own voice. "I learn quickly, Mr. Garrett. I am not afraid of hard work, and I need this to succeed as much as you do." Luke Garrett was quiet for another long moment. Then he asked the question she had been expecting. "Why? You could take your money and find work in Red River Town, or go back to Boston and look for another accounting position. Why risk 90 days on a failing ranch?" Margaret looked around at the dusty office, at the chaos she had transformed into organized possibility, at the evidence that competence and knowledge could overcome apparent disaster. "Because I am tired of being defeated by circumstances I cannot control," she said quietly. "Because I came 2,000 miles to build a new life, and I refuse to give up at the first obstacle. Because I am good at what I do, Mr. Garrett, and I want the chance to prove it." She met his eyes again. "You said there is nothing here for me, but there is something. There is the opportunity to build something with my own hands and my own mind, to be a partner rather than an employee, to have my name on something that matters." Luke Garrett studied her for what felt like an eternity. Then he extended his right hand. "90 days, Miss Brennan. But you have to learn the work. I will not carry someone who only sits at a desk." Margaret shook his hand, feeling the calluses that spoke of years of hard labor. "I am not afraid of work, Mr. Garrett. I am only afraid of having nothing to work toward." They sealed the partnership with that handshake, no lawyers or formal contracts, just two people with nothing to lose and everything to gain, agreeing to try. The next 30 days were the hardest of Margaret's life. Boston had not prepared her for the sheer physical demand of ranch work. Her hands, accustomed to pen and paper, blistered from rope and leather. Her legs, used to city walking, screamed in protest after hours in the saddle. Her back ached from unfamiliar labor. Her skin burned despite the sunbonnet Luke insisted she wear. But she did not complain. Not when she fell off the horse 7 times the first day she tried to ride alone. Not when the rope burned her palms as she learned to handle livestock. Not when she made yet another mistake with the endless fencing that needed repair. Luke Garrett proved to be a patient teacher in the way of men who understand that competence comes from practice rather than natural talent. He did not mock her failures or grow frustrated with her questions. He simply demonstrated each task, watched her attempt it, corrected her mistakes, and made her try again. "Show me once more how to tie that knot," she would say after fumbling the rope for the 5th time. And he would show her again, without comment, his large hands moving with practiced precision, then hand her the rope and wait while she tried to replicate the movement. In the evenings, after the work was done, and they had eaten the simple meals she prepared on the cast-iron stove, Margaret sat at the desk in the office and wrote letters. Professional, courteous letters to the 3 men who owed money for horses. Detailed, precise letters to suppliers proposing new contracts at lower prices. Formal letters to the bank explaining her analysis and requesting a meeting to discuss the ranch's financial future. Luke would sit on the porch after dinner, mending tack or sharpening tools, and sometimes he would watch her through the window as she worked by lamplight, her pen moving across paper with the same focus she brought to every task. They did not speak much during those first weeks. Luke was not a talkative man by nature, and Margaret was too exhausted most days to engage in conversation. But the quiet between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people working toward the same goal, each focused on their part of a larger plan. After 30 days, the first response arrived. George Whitman, who owed $200 for 2 mares, sent a bank draft for the full amount, along with a brief note apologizing for the delay. He had simply forgotten, he claimed, distracted by his own troubles. Margaret held that bank draft like a talisman. $200 out of $740. It was a beginning. The second response came a week later. James McAllister would pay $160 of the $180 he owed, but only if Margaret agreed to accept 4 chickens as payment for the remaining $20. She accepted, calculating that the eggs would provide protein and the eventual sale of chicks would make up the difference. The third debtor, Samuel Morrison, did not respond to her first letter, or her second. Margaret rode to his ranch, a 3-hour journey that left her saddle sore and determined. She presented him with copies of the contract, the delivery receipt, and a detailed calculation of the compounded interest he now owed on the $360 debt. Morrison, a gruff man in his 50s who had probably never had a woman present him with accounting documents before, paid the full amount in cash on the spot. By the end of 30 days, Margaret had collected $520 of the $740 owed. She had renegotiated contracts with 2 suppliers, saving approximately 15% on future purchases, and she had filed the paperwork to activate the grazing permit. The evening she counted out the money and made her report to Luke, He sat across from her at the desk and studied the neat columns of her ledger. "You collected more in 30 days than Marcus managed in 6 months," he said finally. Margaret closed the ledger. Numbers do not care about gender or intimidation. Mr. Garrett, they only care about accuracy and persistence. Luke looked up from the ledger to her face. "You did well, Miss Brennan." The simple praise delivered without ceremony or exaggeration meant more than any flowery compliment could have. Margaret felt warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the Texas heat. "We did well," she corrected. "I could not have survived here without your teaching." Over the following weeks the work continued. Margaret learned to ride without falling, to mend fence, without hammering her fingers, to cook over an open fire, without burning everything. She grew stronger, her soft Boston hands developing calluses, her city pale skin tanning despite the sunbonnet. Luke taught her to read the sky for weather, to recognize when a horse was off balance, to move with the rhythm of ranch life, rather than fighting against it. He taught her in the spare, efficient way of men who demonstrate rather than explain, and she learned in the focused, determined way of women who refuse to fail. They fell into a routine. Early rising before the heat became unbearable. Work through the morning. Brief rest during the hottest part of the day. More work in the cooler evening. Simple meals eaten together without much conversation. Margaret's evening accounting work while Luke maintained equipment, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the ranch began to recover. Fences stood straight where before they had sagged. The barn doors hung properly on new hinges. The horses looked sleeker, healthier, better cared for. The chaos of Marcus Thornton's neglect gave way to the order of careful management. 45 days into their partnership, Margaret rode alone to Red River Town to collect the final outstanding debt. It was a Saturday, and the small town was busy with ranchers coming in for supplies. She tied her horse outside the general store and walked in with her carpetbag containing account books and documentation. The debtor, William Ashford, owned the livery stable. He was a large man with suspicious eyes and a reputation for avoiding obligations. Margaret had learned this from casual conversation with Luke, though her partner had been careful not to influence her approach. "Mr. Ashford," she said after introducing herself, "I have come to discuss the $200 you owe T-Bar Ranch for the stallion purchased 14 months ago." Ashford barely looked up from the horseshoe he was examining. "Do not know anything about that." Margaret set her carpetbag on his workbench and removed the contract. "This is your signature, Mr. Ashford. The horse was delivered on May 3rd of last year. Payment was due within 30 days. It is now 14 months later, and the debt remains outstanding." He glanced at the paper. "Marcus Thornton is dead. Ranch is bankrupt. I do not see why I should pay a debt to a place that no longer exists." Margaret had prepared for this argument. "The ranch exists, Mr. Ashford. I am its current manager. The debt is legally enforceable. You received the horse. You owe the money." Ashford set down the horseshoe and crossed his arms, using his size to intimidate. "Little lady, this is Texas. Things work different here than wherever you came from. Maybe you should go back to your accounting and let men handle business matters." Margaret felt anger rise in her chest, but she kept her voice level and professional. "Mr. Ashford, I am giving you the opportunity to pay this debt voluntarily. If you refuse, I will file a claim with the county court. The documentation is thorough, and your signature is clear. A judge will rule in my favor. At that point, you will owe not only the $200, but also court costs and legal fees." She let that sink in, then added quietly, "I rode 3 hours to come here in good faith, Mr. Ashford. I am asking you to do the right thing. Pay what you owe." Something in her tone or her unwavering gaze must have convinced him she was serious. Ashford studied her for a long moment, then cursed under his breath and walked to his office. He returned with a small pouch of coins. $200, he said, dumping the coins on the workbench. "Now get out of my livery." Margaret counted the money carefully, made a notation in her account book, and wrote out a receipt. She handed it to Ashford without comment, packed her carpetbag, and walked out with her head high and her heart pounding. She had done it. $740 collected in full, plus the renegotiated contracts, plus the grazing permit activation. As she rode back toward T-Bar Ranch in the afternoon heat, Margaret Brennan felt something she had not experienced since the day Henderson Textile closed. She felt competent, capable, valued. She was no longer just a displaced Boston accounting clerk. She was becoming something else, something stronger. Luke was working in the corral when she arrived, training a young colt. He looked up as she dismounted, and she held up the pouch of coins without speaking. His weathered face broke into a genuine smile, the first real smile she had seen from him. "You collected from Ashford, every penny." Luke climbed down from the corral fence and walked over to where she stood, dusty and tired and triumphant. "Miss Brennan, when you first arrived here 60 days ago, I thought you would last 3 days, maybe a week if you were stubborn." Margaret met his eyes, seeing respect there that had not existed before. "And now I think maybe Marcus Thornton was not the only one who failed to see what this ranch could be." That evening, they sat on the porch of the main house, watching the sun set over the prairie in shades of orange and golden purple. Margaret had made her calculations, updating the ledgers with the final payments. "We have $1,040, she said, enough to pay nearly half the bank debt. With the cost savings from the new supplier contracts and the grazing permit, we can generate sufficient income to pay the remainder within 12 to 18 months. Luke stared out at the land that was somehow not quite his, but not quite not his either. Then quietly he said, "I gave up, Miss Brennan. After Marcus died and the bank took over, I stayed because the animals needed care, but I had given up on the ranch itself. I thought it was finished." Margaret understood. She had given up too in Boston when the factory closed and the jobs disappeared and every door shut in her face. She had come to Texas not with hope, but with the absence of alternatives. "We had both given up," she said softly. "Maybe that is why this is working. We had nothing left to lose, so we risked everything." Luke turned to look at her, his face thoughtful in the dying light. 90 days was the agreement. We are 2/3 through that. What happens at the end? Margaret had been thinking about that question for weeks. She knew the answer, but had been afraid to voice it, afraid that speaking the words would reveal too much about what she wanted. "I would like to continue," she said carefully, "not as temporary partners, but as permanent ones, equal shares, your knowledge and my management, building something that belongs to both of us." Luke was quiet for so long she thought he would refuse. Then he extended his hand across the space between them. "Equal partners, Miss Brennan, 50-50. Your name on the deed, same as mine." They shook hands as the sun disappeared below the horizon and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Two people who had come to partnership through deception and desperation, choosing now to make it real. Margaret Brennan had traveled 2,000 miles looking for Daniel Thorne, a man who did not exist. Instead, she had found Luke Garrett, a man who very much did. And together with her accounting skills and his ranching knowledge, they were building something that would last. The 90 days became 120, then 150. By September, Margaret and Luke no longer spoke of temporary partnership. This was permanent, though neither had yet named it as such. The work consumed their days while something quieter grew between them in the evenings spent on the porch, planning the ranch's future in words that increasingly included "we" and "our" instead of "I" and "mine." The morning of day 167 found Margaret standing in the doorway of the ranch office, looking out at land that had begun to feel like home. The September heat had broken overnight, replaced by the first hint of autumn coolness that promised relief from the brutal Texas summer. Luke was already working in the corral, his movements as efficient and purposeful as always, breaking a young gelding to saddle. She watched him for a moment, noting the patience in his approach. He never forced the animal, never lost his temper when the horse shied or balked. He simply waited, speaking in that low, calm voice, until the gelding settled enough to accept another step in the process. It was the same approach he had taken with her, she realized. Patient instruction without judgment, allowing competence to develop through practice rather than demanding immediate perfection. The partnership was working better than either of them had anticipated. The ranch now operated with a precision that Marcus Thornton had never achieved. Morning routines flowed smoothly, the livestock looked healthier, the buildings showed signs of repair and maintenance, the accounting books balanced to the penny. But Margaret's mind was not on the ranch this morning. Today she would ride into Red River town, and she was bringing with her an idea that would either save the community or mark her as a meddling outsider who did not understand Texas ways. She saddled her mare a calm bay named Patience that Luke had selected specifically for her reliability. The name had amused Margaret at first, but she had come to appreciate its appropriateness. Patience never spooked, never rushed, never created problems. She simply did what was asked with steady competence. Much like Margaret herself, she thought with wry humor. The ride to Red River took 2 hours. Margaret used the time to rehearse her presentation, running through numbers and arguments in her mind the way she had once prepared reports for her supervisor at Henderson Textile. The mathematics were sound, the logic was irrefutable, but she was proposing something that had never been tried in Red River County, and men who worked with cattle and horses were not always impressed by columns of figures. Red River town appeared on the horizon like a question mark. From a distance it looked substantial enough, but as Margaret drew closer she could see the signs of slow decay that marked so many frontier settlements. Empty buildings with broken windows, businesses that had closed their doors permanently, a general store that should have been bustling on a Saturday morning but showed only a handful of customers. She had learned the town's history from Luke during their evening conversations. Red River had been founded 12 years earlier during a cattle boom growing rapidly to nearly 600 residents. But the boom had not lasted. Drought years, falling beef prices, and the consolidation of small ranches into larger operations had steadily drained the population. Now barely 340 people remained, and that number decreased each year as families gave up and moved to cities where opportunities still existed. The town was dying, not with dramatic violence, but with the slow, quiet surrender of economic inevitability. Margaret tied Patience outside the Red River Bank, a solid brick building that stood in stark contrast to the weathered wooden structures surrounding it. The bank's solidity was intentional, designed to project permanence and reliability, even as everything around it crumbled. She removed her account ledgers from the saddlebags and walked inside. The interior was cool and dim after the bright morning sunlight. A young clerk sat at a desk near the front, copying entries from one ledger to another with careful precision. He looked up as Margaret entered, his expression moving from curiosity to wariness when he registered her gender and Eastern clothes. "I need to speak with Mr. Blackwood," Margaret said. "I have business to discuss regarding T Bar Ranch." The clerk's wariness deepened. "Mr. Blackwood is very busy, ma'am. Perhaps you could leave a message and he will contact you when time permits." Margaret set her ledgers on the clerk's desk with deliberate care. "Please inform Mr. Blackwood that Margaret Brennan, financial manager of T Bar Ranch, is here to discuss a payment on the outstanding debt. I will wait." The phrase financial manager had the desired effect. The clerk rose immediately and disappeared through a door behind him. Margaret waited, her hands folded calmly in front of her, projecting a confidence she did not entirely feel. Cyrus Blackwood emerged within 2 minutes. He was a man of perhaps 45, well-dressed in a suit that would not have looked out of place in Boston. His beard was neatly trimmed, his boots polished to a high shine. Everything about him spoke of prosperity and control, but his eyes were calculating and cold. "Miss Brennan," he said, his tone carefully neutral, "my clerk tells me you wish to discuss the T-Bar debt. Please come into my office." She followed him into a private room dominated by a large mahogany desk. The walls were lined with ledgers similar to her own, documenting the financial transactions that flowed through Red River County. This was a man who understood numbers as well as she did. That made him either a potential ally or a dangerous adversary. Blackwood gestured to a chair and seated himself behind the desk. "The T-Bar Ranch owes this bank $2,400, Miss Brennan. The original loan was made to Marcus Thornton 5 years ago. Upon his death, the debt became due immediately. However, I have allowed Mr. Garrett to remain on the property to care for the livestock while we determine the best course of action." Margaret opened her primary ledger and turned it so Blackwood could see the neat columns of figures. "I am aware of the debt, Mr. Blackwood. I am here to make a payment of $1,040 with the remainder to be paid according to a structured schedule over the next 15 months. Surprise flickered across Blackwood's face. His fingers drummed once on the desk surface, the only sign of reaction he allowed himself. That is a substantial payment. May I ask how you managed to collect such a sum from a bankrupt operation? Through proper financial management, debt collection, contract renegotiation, and utilization of unused assets. Margaret kept her voice professional and matter-of-fact. Marcus Thornton was not a poor rancher, Mr. Blackwood. He was a poor manager. The ranch itself remains viable with appropriate oversight. Blackwood leaned back in his chair, studying her with those cold, calculating eyes. You are an unusual woman, Miss Brennan. Most ladies would have returned to wherever they came from after discovering they had been deceived by a false suitor. The words stung because they were designed to. Blackwood was testing her, probing for weakness. Margaret met his gaze without flinching. I came to Texas to build a life, Mr. Blackwood. That goal has not changed simply because the circumstances were different than anticipated. Now shall we discuss the payment schedule for the remaining debt? For the next 20 minutes they negotiated terms with the careful precision of two people who understood that every word in a contract carried weight. Blackwood was shrewd but fair in his business dealings. Margaret gave him no reason to refuse her proposal. The mathematics were sound, the payment schedule reasonable, the collateral adequate. Finally, Blackwood extended his hand across the desk. Agreed, Miss Brennan. $1,040 today, with the remainder paid in monthly installments of $90 over 15 months. The ranch remains collateral until the debt is satisfied in full. They shook hands. Margaret counted out the money she had brought, accepting a receipt that documented the transaction. She was preparing to leave when Blackwood spoke again. Miss Brennan, I wonder if you would be willing to discuss another matter, one that might be of mutual benefit. Margaret settled back into her chair, curious. I am listening, Mr. Blackwood. You have clearly demonstrated financial competence in managing the T-bar accounts. I wonder if you might be interested in similar work on a larger scale. Several businesses in Red River County are struggling with the same issues that plagued Marcus Thornton. Poor record-keeping, uncollected debts, inefficient operations. I have been considering hiring someone to assist these businesses in getting their finances in order. Someone with your skills could be quite valuable. The offer was tempting. Paid employment doing work she was good at with the backing of the most powerful man in the county. It was exactly the kind of opportunity she had sought unsuccessfully in Boston. But something in Blackwood's tone made her hesitate. What would happen to these businesses once their finances are organized, Mr. Blackwood? His smile was thin and cold. That would depend on their individual circumstances, Miss Brennan. Some might recover, others might discover that their situations are more dire than they realized. In such cases, I would naturally offer to purchase their assets at fair market value, sparing them the embarrassment of public bankruptcy. Margaret understood immediately. Blackwood wanted her to organize the financial records of struggling businesses so he could more easily acquire them when they failed. Her competence would be used as a tool to accelerate the consolidation of Red River County's assets into his hands. That is a generous offer, Mr. Blackwood, she said carefully, but I am quite occupied with T-Bar Ranch at present. Perhaps in the future, when our debt is fully satisfied. His expression did not change, but Margaret sensed disappointment beneath the carefully maintained neutrality. As you wish, Miss Brennan. The offer remains open should your circumstances change. She left the bank with the receipt for her payment and a clearer understanding of the forces shaping Red River County. Cyrus Blackwood was not an evil man. He was simply a businessman who saw opportunity in other people's failures. In Boston, she had known dozens like him. Men who prospered during economic panics by purchasing assets at depressed prices, then selling them when conditions improved. But Red River was not Boston. Here, the businesses Blackwood acquired were not abstract assets. They were the general store where families bought their supplies, the livery where travelers stabled their horses, the boarding house where newcomers found lodging. When these places closed, the community died a little more. Margaret walked down the main street, observing the town with new eyes. She counted 4 empty storefronts. The saloon that should have been busy on a Saturday afternoon stood nearly empty. Even the church at the end of the street showed signs of neglect, its white paint peeling its steps sagging. She stopped at the general store, a substantial building that somehow managed to look both prosperous and desperate. A hand-painted sign over the door read, "Briggs General Merchandise, established 1873. Through the window she could see shelves that were only partially stocked, suggesting either poor business or inability to purchase adequate inventory. A bell chimed as she entered. The interior was dim and cool, smelling of wood smoke, leather, and the indefinable scent of accumulated merchandise. An older man stood behind the counter, tallying figures in a ledger with the careful concentration of someone for whom every penny mattered. He looked up as Margaret approached, his weathered face creasing into a professional smile. "Help you, ma'am." Margaret introduced herself and explained her connection to T-Bar Ranch. The smile became more genuine when he heard Luke Garrett's name. "Luke is a good man," the storekeeper said. "I am Samuel Briggs." "Samuel, this establishment is mine for whatever that is worth these days." "Business is difficult," Margaret asked, though she could already see the answer in the half-empty shelves and the anxiety in Briggs's expression. Samuel sighed, setting down his pencil. "Difficult does not begin to describe it, Miss Brennan. I owe the bank $680. Interest accrues monthly at 18%. I cannot afford to stock my shelves adequately because every spare dollar goes to interest payments. And because my shelves are poorly stocked, customers go to Fort Worth for their supplies, which means even less income. I am caught in a spiral I cannot escape." Margaret felt a familiar tightness in her chest. She had seen this same spiral destroy Henderson Textile. Reduced orders leading to reduced employment, leading to reduced production, leading to further reduced orders. A death spiral that fed on itself until nothing remained. But unlike the factory closure, which had been driven by forces beyond anyone's control, Samuel Briggs's situation had a solution. "May I see your account books, Mr. Briggs?" He hesitated, pride warring with desperation. Then he retrieved a leather-bound ledger from beneath the counter and handed it to her. Margaret spent the next hour studying Samuel Briggs's finances while he served the handful of customers who wandered in. The story the numbers told was predictable and tragic. Briggs was paying far too much for his merchandise, buying in small quantities from traveling salesmen who charged premium prices. His profit margins were razor thin. The bank interest consumed what little surplus he generated. But he also had assets Blackwood would pay well for. The building was solid and well located. The inventory, though sparse, had value. The customer relationships represented goodwill worth more than the physical assets. If Briggs sold to Blackwood now, he would receive perhaps $800 after the debt was settled, enough to relocate somewhere cheaper, start over with nothing. Not enough to maintain dignity or hope. Margaret closed the ledger and looked at Samuel Briggs. "Mr. Briggs, what if you could purchase your merchandise for 25% less than your current costs?" He laughed without humor. "That would solve everything, Miss Brennan, but there is no such opportunity available to a small store in a dying town. What if there were?" Margaret leaned forward, her mind racing through possibilities. What if 5 or 6 small businesses pooled their purchasing power, bought directly from wholesalers in Fort Worth rather than from traveling salesmen, split the transportation costs? The volume would be small by city standards, but substantial enough to command better prices. Samuel's expression shifted from skepticism to cautious interest. That would require cooperation between businesses that normally compete with each other. "Your only competition is Blackwood," Margaret said bluntly. "And his goal is to acquire every business in Red River County at bankruptcy prices. Cooperation might be your only alternative to surrender." She spent another 2 hours in Red River that day, visiting the boarding house owned by a widow named Ida Henderson, the blacksmith shop run by a taciturn man named Jacob Walsh, and the small restaurant operated by a couple from Missouri. She told each of them the same thing. Individually, you are failing. Together, you might survive. By the time she rode back to T-Bar Ranch, the sun was setting and her mind was full of calculations. If she could organize 5 businesses into a cooperative purchasing system, they could reduce costs by 20 to 30%. That would not solve all their problems, but it would buy them time. Time to rebuild customer loyalty. Time to generate profit. Time to pay down debt and stabilize operations. It was ambitious. It was unconventional. It might fail spectacularly. But doing nothing guaranteed failure. Luke was waiting on the porch when she arrived, a lamp glowing yellow in the gathering darkness. He took her horse without comment, unsaddled, and brushed the mare while Margaret washed road dust from her face and hands at the pump. When she joined him on the porch, he handed her a cup of coffee and waited. Margaret told him everything: the payment to Blackwood, the offer of employment she had refused, the struggling businesses she had visited, the idea that had taken shape during her conversations. Luke listened without interrupting, his face thoughtful in the lamplight. When she finished, he sat quietly for a long time. "You want to save the whole town," he said finally. "I want to save people who are trying to survive against impossible odds," Margaret corrected, "the way someone saved me by giving me a chance when every logical reason said he should not." Luke looked at her, and something passed between them in that moment, an understanding deeper than words. They were both people who had been saved by unlikely partnerships, both people who knew what it meant to face defeat and choose to fight anyway. "It will be hard," he said. "Ranchers and storekeepers are proud people. They do not like accepting help, especially from outsiders. Then we will have to convince them it is not charity," Margaret replied. "We will have to show them the mathematics, the logic, the practical benefit. We will have to make it a business decision rather than a rescue." Luke nodded slowly. "When do you want to start?" "There is a town meeting next Saturday," Margaret said. "I asked Reverend Matthews if I could speak." He agreed. His expression shifted to surprise. "You are going to present this idea to the whole town. Someone has to be first," Margaret said quietly, repeating words Luke himself had once spoken to her. "Unless everyone gives up." The week before the town meeting felt longer than the previous 167 days combined. Margaret prepared her presentation with the same meticulous attention to detail she had once brought to factory accounts. She created charts showing current costs versus projected cooperative costs. She drafted sample contracts. She calculated potential savings for each participating business. Luke helped in his quiet way, offering insights into the personalities she would face, suggesting arguments that might resonate with proud frontiermen who distrusted change. By Saturday morning, Margaret had rehearsed her presentation so many times she could deliver it in her sleep. But as she dressed in her best remaining dress and brushed dust from her good shoes, her hands trembled slightly. This was different from collecting debts or negotiating with Blackwood. This was standing before an entire community and proposing something radical, asking them to trust a woman they barely knew with ideas that challenged everything they had always done. The church was full when they arrived. Word had spread that the Boston woman from T-Bar Ranch wanted to address the community, and curiosity, if nothing else, had brought people out. Margaret counted perhaps 40 adults in the pews, their faces ranging from friendly curiosity to outright hostility. Cyrus Blackwood sat in the front row, his expression neutral, but his presence intentional, a reminder that he held the financial power in this room. Reverend Matthews introduced Margaret with kind words about newcomers bringing fresh perspectives. Then he stepped aside, and Margaret stood before the congregation, her heart pounding, but her voice steady. "My name is Margaret Brennan. 3 months ago, I arrived in Red River County with 43 cents and a trunk of belongings. I had been deceived by a man who never existed. I had lost my employment in Boston. I had nowhere else to go." She paused, letting them absorb this. She was not hiding her circumstances or pretending to be more than she was. "Mr. Garrett gave me an opportunity when he had no logical reason to do so. In return, I brought skills he did not possess. Together we collected debts, renegotiated contracts, and organized finances. This morning, T-Bar Ranch is solvent and profitable for the first time in years." She produced her charts and displayed them on a board Reverend Matthews had provided. "I tell you this not to boast, but to demonstrate what proper financial management can achieve, and to propose that what worked for one ranch might work for an entire community." For the next 20 minutes, she explained the cooperative purchasing concept. She showed the numbers. She addressed concerns. She answered questions with patience and precision. The resistance came from exactly where Luke had predicted it would. Wade Cooper, the largest rancher in the area after Blackwood, stood and voiced what many were thinking. "Miss Brennan, your success with T-Bar Ranch is admirable, but this cooperative idea requires us to trust our money and our business relationships to someone we barely know. Why should we believe you understand Texas commerce better than men who have lived here for decades? The question was fair, and Margaret had prepared for it. Mr. Cooper, I do not claim to understand Texas better than you, but I do understand accounting, debt management, and cooperative purchasing. These principles work the same whether the business is in Boston or Red River County. The mathematics do not change based on geography. She gestured to her charts. I am not asking you to trust me personally, Mr. Cooper. I am asking you to trust the numbers. If they are wrong, prove it. Show me where my calculations fail. If they are correct, then refusing to act on them is simply pride masquerading as wisdom. The blunt words created a ripple of reaction through the congregation. Some nodded in agreement. Others looked scandalized that a woman would speak so directly to a man of Cooper's standing. Cyrus Blackwood stood, and the room fell silent. His voice was measured and reasonable, as always. Miss Brennan raises interesting points. However, I feel obligated to note that cooperative ventures carry significant risk. If one member fails to pay their share, all members suffer. If merchandise proves defective, all members bear the cost. These businesses are already struggling. Adding the risk of collective failure to their individual challenges seems unwise. Margaret had expected this argument. You are correct that cooperative ventures carry risk, Mr. Blackwood, but so does isolation. Every business in this room currently faces the certainty of failure if nothing changes. The cooperative offers the possibility of survival. I would argue that possible success is preferable to certain defeat. Blackwood smiled his cold smile. Spoken like someone who has never lost everything, Miss Brennan. Those of us who have built businesses over decades understand that preservation sometimes requires difficult choices. Selling to someone with the resources to sustain operations might be more prudent than gambling on untested theories. There it was. Blackwood's true position stated plainly. Sell to him now, while the assets still had value, rather than risk losing everything in a failed experiment. Margaret met his gaze without flinching. I have lost everything, Mr. Blackwood. I lost my employment, my home, my savings, and my dignity when I was forced to travel 2,000 miles to marry a man who did not exist. I understand difficult choices. The difference is that I believe people have the right to make those choices for themselves rather than having them imposed by economic pressure. Samuel Briggs stood, his weathered face uncertain but determined. I would like to try Miss Brennan. I do not know if your cooperative will work, but I know that continuing as I am guarantees failure. If you are willing to organize it, I am willing to participate. Ida Henderson rose next. The boarding house joins as well. One by one other voices joined. Jacob Walsh from the blacksmith shop, the restaurant owners from Missouri, a small rancher who was barely surviving. Not everyone agreed. Wade Cooper remained skeptical. Several others sided with Blackwood's caution. But when Reverend Matthews called for a show of hands, 8 businesses indicated willingness to participate. Margaret felt relief flood through her. 8 was enough. 8 businesses could generate sufficient volume to negotiate with Fort Worth wholesalers. 8 could split transportation costs and reduce individual risk. 8 could survive. The meeting concluded with Margaret promising detailed contracts within the week. As people filed out, several approached to ask specific questions. Luke stood to one side watching but not interfering, letting her handle the conversations. Blackwood was the last to leave. He paused as he passed Margaret, speaking quietly enough that only she and Luke could hear. This is a mistake, Miss Brennan. You are giving false hope to people who would be better served accepting reality. When the cooperative fails, and it will fail, the consequences will be worse than if they had simply sold their businesses cleanly now. Margaret held his gaze. Perhaps you are correct, Mr. Blackwood, but I would rather fail trying than succeed through surrender. These people deserve the chance to fight for what they have built. Blackwood studied her for a moment longer, then nodded slightly and left. Luke moved to stand beside Margaret as the church emptied. You made enemies today, he observed. I made allies too, Margaret replied, and I gave people hope. That has to count for something. The next 2 months were a whirlwind of organization. Margaret drafted contracts that protected individual members while creating collective bargaining power. She traveled to Fort Worth 3 times to negotiate with wholesalers using the combined purchasing volume of 8 businesses to secure prices that none could have achieved alone. The logistics were complex, coordinating delivery schedules, consolidating orders, splitting costs, managing disagreements when 2 members wanted conflicting terms. Every day brought new problems that required diplomatic solutions. But the mathematics worked exactly as Margaret had calculated. By the end of the first month, participating businesses had reduced their merchandise costs by an average of 27%. Samuel Briggs restocked his shelves properly for the first time in 2 years. Ida Henderson renovated 2 rooms at the boarding house. The restaurant purchased a new stove. Small improvements, but visible ones, the kind that generated momentum. Margaret worked harder than she ever had in Boston, managing T-Bar Ranch finances, organizing the cooperative, mediating disputes, teaching basic accounting to business owners who had never kept proper records. By the end of each day, she was exhausted, falling into bed too tired even to remove her boots. But she was not unhappy. For the first time in her life, her work mattered in ways she could see and touch. The numbers in her ledgers represented real people whose lives improved because of her efforts. That satisfaction went deeper than any paycheck had ever reached. Luke watched her work with quiet concern. He said nothing, but he began taking over more of her ranch duties without being asked. He prepared simple meals when she worked through dinner. He kept the lamp filled with oil for her late-night accounting sessions. They did not speak of what was developing between them. There was no time, and perhaps no need. But the partnership that had begun as business arrangement was evolving into something neither had anticipated or named. It was during the harvest dance in late November that things finally crystallized. Red River held the dance annually, a celebration that marked the end of growing season and the beginning of winter preparation. Margaret had heard about it, but assumed she would be too busy with cooperative work to attend. Luke had other ideas. "You are going," he announced one evening as they finished dinner. "You have worked yourself nearly to death for 3 months. One night of not working will not destroy the cooperative." Margaret started to protest, then saw the determination in his eyes. "Very well," she conceded, "but I do not have appropriate clothing for a dance." "The dress you wear to church will do fine," Luke said. "This is Red River, not a Boston ballroom. Nobody expects fancy." The dance was held in the town hall, a large room with rough wooden floors and walls decorated with autumn leaves and dried corn stalks. When Margaret and Luke arrived, the space was already crowded with families from across the county. A small band consisting of fiddle, guitar, and accordion played lively tunes that had people clapping and stomping in rhythm. Margaret felt suddenly self-conscious in her simple dress and practical shoes. But Ida Henderson swept over immediately, linking arms and pulling her into the crowd. "You look lovely, dear. Now come dance before Luke changes his mind about sharing you." The evening passed in a blur of music and movement. Margaret danced with Samuel Briggs, with Jacob Walsh, even with Wade Cooper, who had softened his opposition to the cooperative after seeing its initial success. Between dances, she sat with the women listening to conversations about children and recipes and the everyday concerns that formed the fabric of community life. But she was most aware of Luke. He stood at the edge of the room for much of the evening, declining invitations to dance, simply watching. Several women approached him, but he sent them away politely. His eyes followed Margaret as she moved through the crowd. Finally, as the evening grew late and the music slowed to gentler melodies, Luke crossed the room and extended his hand. "Dance with me, Margaret." It was not a request. She took his hand and let him lead her to the floor. Luke was not a graceful dancer, but he was steady and sure-moving, with the same patient competence he brought to everything. They danced without speaking for several minutes, the music washing over them, the crowd fading to insignificance. "When you arrived 90 days ago," Luke said quietly, "I thought you would leave after a week, maybe less." The ranch was failing, and I was barely holding on. Adding a Boston woman who knew nothing about Texas seemed like a burden I could not afford. His arms tightened slightly around her. "I was wrong about everything." Margaret looked up at him, seeing vulnerability in his expression that he usually kept hidden. "You gave me a chance when no one else would have, Luke. You taught me how to survive here, The ranch's recovery is as much your achievement as mine." Luke shook his head. "The ranch recovered because you brought skills I did not have. But you brought more than accounting Margaret. You brought hope, not just to the ranch, but to this whole town. People who were ready to give up are fighting again because you showed them it was possible." He stopped dancing, though the music continued around them. "When I lost Anna and the baby, I thought I was done with living. I went through motions, but I was not really alive. Then you showed up with those ledgers and more determination than I had ever seen. And you reminded me that life continues, that giving up is a choice, not an inevitability." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. She had not cried since leaving Boston, pride and necessity keeping emotions locked down. But Luke's words touched something deep inside that pride could not protect. "I was running away," she admitted, "from failure and humiliation and the knowledge that I did not matter to anyone. I told myself I was looking for Daniel Thorne, but really I was looking for a place where my existence meant something." She met his eyes. "I found that place, Luke, with you, with this ranch, with this community that gave me a chance to prove my worth." Luke lifted one calloused hand to her face, touching her cheek with surprising gentleness. "Margaret Brennan, I am not good with words. I cannot make pretty speeches or grand gestures, but I can tell you that these past months working beside you have been the best of my life since Anna died. You make me want to build instead of just survive. You make me believe in futures again." He paused, gathering courage. "I am asking if you will stay, not as a temporary partner, but as a permanent one, not just in business but in life, as my wife, if you will have me." Margaret's heart hammered in her chest. The proposal was characteristically Luke. No flowers, no romantic setting, no rehearsed declaration, just honest words spoken with quiet intensity in the middle of a crowded dance floor. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I will stay. Yes, I will marry you. Yes to all of it." Luke smiled, then a real smile that transformed his weathered face. He pulled her close, and they danced the rest of the song without speaking, two people who had found in each other what they had not known they needed. The engagement announcement created ripples through Red River County. Some were pleased, seeing it as confirmation that the cooperative partnership would continue long-term. Others were skeptical, suggesting that a marriage of convenience would not last beyond the legal benefits it provided. Cyrus Blackwood was among the skeptics. He encountered Margaret at the bank a week after the dance, his expression coolly assessing. "Congratulations on your engagement, Miss Brennan, or should I say, Mrs. Garrett to be, a fortuitous development for T-Bar Ranch's legal standing." Margaret met his gaze without flinching. "Luke and I are marrying because we wish to build a life together, Mr. Blackwood. The legal benefits are incidental." "Of course," Blackwood said smoothly. "I am certain your feelings are entirely genuine. It simply strikes me as convenient timing given that the final bank payment is due in 3 months. A married woman has considerably more legal authority to negotiate on behalf of ranch assets than an unmarried partner." The implication was clear. Blackwood suspected the marriage was primarily a business arrangement designed to strengthen Margaret's legal position. She could have been insulted. Instead, she felt only pity for a man whose calculating nature prevented him from understanding that some partnerships transcended calculation. "The timing is convenient," she agreed. "But so was the timing of my arrival. So was Luke's willingness to give me a chance. So is every fortunate circumstance that shapes our lives. The question is not whether we recognize opportunity, but what we do with it." She gathered her papers and prepared to leave. "Luke and I are building something that will outlast both of us, Mr. Blackwood. A ranch, a community, a life. You are welcome to interpret our motives however you wish, but the result will be the same regardless of your skepticism." December brought the first serious cold. The cooperative's second month showed even stronger results than the first, with cost savings allowing several businesses to make substantial payments on their debts. Samuel Briggs calculated that at current rates he would be debt-free within 18 months. Ida Henderson hired a part-time worker for the first time in 3 years. But success brought new challenges. As the cooperative grew stronger, tensions developed between members and non-members. Businesses that had declined to participate now faced a competitive disadvantage. Their costs remained high, while cooperative members enjoyed reduced prices. Some responded by cutting their own costs through reduced quality or service. Others grew resentful. Wade Cooper approached Margaret in town one afternoon, his expression troubled. "Miss Brennan, we need to talk about the cooperative." They sat on a bench outside the general store while Cooper explained his concerns. The cooperative was working too well. Businesses inside it were thriving, while those outside it struggled. The divide was creating resentment and conflict within the community. Cooper himself had not joined, viewing it as unnecessary for his larger operation, but watching smaller ranches succeed while his own profits stagnated had changed his perspective. "I was wrong," he admitted. "I let pride keep me from seeing what you were offering. Now I am paying the price for that pride, and so are others who followed my lead in refusing to participate." Can the cooperative expand to include additional members? Margaret considered the question carefully. The contracts were written to allow expansion, but adding new members would dilute the benefits for existing ones unless the new members brought proportional purchasing volume. She explained this to Cooper, then proposed a solution. If you and the other non-members can coordinate your orders, the combined volume might justify expansion. But it would require the same cooperation and record sharing that current members accept. "Are you willing to commit to that level of transparency?" Cooper nodded slowly. "I am, and I will talk to the others. We were fools to resist change out of pride. Better to admit that mistake now than continue down a path to failure." The expanded cooperative became operational in January, growing from 8 members to 14. The increased volume allowed even better pricing from Fort Worth wholesalers. The competitive resentment faded as more businesses shared in the benefits. By late January, Red River Town showed visible signs of recovery. Storefronts that had been empty were reoccupied. The restaurant expanded its hours. Samuel Briggs hired his first employee in 4 years. Even the church received a fresh coat of paint funded by donations from businesses that finally had surplus income. Margaret watched these changes with quiet satisfaction. The numbers in her ledgers represented more than profit and loss. They represented families staying rather than leaving. Children attending school rather than being pulled from class to work. A community choosing to fight rather than surrender. Luke watched Margaret with his own satisfaction. The woman who had arrived with nothing had transformed not just their ranch, but an entire county. She had taken the skills that Boston had dismissed as worthless and proved their value in ways that transcended simple employment. The wedding was scheduled for February 14th, a date Margaret chose with deliberate symbolism. Valentine's Day seemed appropriate for a marriage that had grown from partnership into genuine affection. But 10 days before the ceremony, disaster struck. Margaret was working in the ranch office when she heard rapid hoofbeats approaching. Luke burst through the door, his face grim. "Get your account books, all of them. We are going to the bank immediately." "What happened?" "Blackwood is calling in the cooperative debts. All of them. Full payment due within 30 days, or he will seize assets." Margaret felt ice flood her veins. "That is not possible. The contracts specify payment schedules. He cannot simply demand immediate payment." Luke handed her a document. "He is claiming breach of contract. Says the cooperative members failed to maintain adequate insurance on inventory. Says that violates the loan terms and triggers acceleration clauses." Margaret scanned the document, her accounting mind working rapidly through the legal language. The accusation was technically accurate. None of the cooperative members carried formal insurance on their inventory. Insurance was expensive, and most frontier businesses operated on trust and reputation rather than formal policies. But the loan contracts had never explicitly required insurance. Blackwood was interpreting ambiguous language in the most aggressive way possible, seeking to force a crisis that would allow him to acquire cooperative businesses at distressed prices. "This is retaliation," Margaret said. "He is angry that the cooperative succeeded and angry that I refused his offer of employment. He wants to destroy what we built." Luke's expression was grim. "Can he do it legally?" Margaret studied the contract more carefully. The language was ambiguous enough that a sympathetic judge might rule either way. But judges in frontier counties often sided with banks and established power rather than with newcomers and outsiders. "He can try," she said. "Whether he succeeds depends on how we respond." They rode to Red River, immediately gathering the cooperative members for an emergency meeting. The mood was grim. As Margaret explained the situation, 8 businesses were directly threatened. If they failed, the others would quickly follow as the cooperative's purchasing volume collapsed. Samuel Briggs voiced what everyone was thinking. "We cannot pay the full amounts within 30 days. It is impossible. We are all making payments on schedule, but none of us have the resources to satisfy the debts completely." "Exactly what Blackwood is counting on," Jacob Walsh said bitterly. "He wants us to default so he can take everything." Margaret let them vent their anger and fear for several minutes. Then she stood and walked to the front of the room. "May I see everyone's loan contracts?" For the next 2 hours, she studied the documents with forensic attention to detail, comparing language, searching for inconsistencies or weaknesses. Luke sat beside her, occasionally pointing out passages he thought might be relevant, though he could not explain why. Finally, Margaret set down the last contract and looked up at the anxious faces surrounding her. Mr. Blackwood made a mistake, not in the law but in the mathematics. She spread the contracts on the table. These loans were made at different times over the past 5 years. The interest rates vary from 16 to 19%. But look at the acceleration clauses. They are identical in every contract, copied from some standard template without adjustment for individual circumstances. Samuel frowned. "I do not understand how that helps us, because the standard template assumes a single borrower, but the cooperative operates as a collective entity. If Blackwood wants to claim that breach by one member triggers acceleration for all members, then he has inadvertently created a legal argument that all contracts are interconnected. That means if one contract is invalid, they all become questionable." Wade Cooper leaned forward. "Are you saying one of these contracts is invalid?" Margaret pointed to Samuel Briggs's loan document. "This contract requires insurance on inventory, but it does not specify the amount of coverage or the type of policy. Mr. Briggs, do you carry any insurance at all?" Samuel nodded slowly. "I have fire insurance on the building. Had it for 8 years?" Margaret felt triumph surge through her. "Then you have complied with the contract requirement. The document says insurance, not inventory insurance specifically. Fire insurance is insurance. Mr. Blackwood's claim of breach is invalid, which means his attempt to accelerate payment is improper, which means if the contracts are interconnected, as his own argument suggests, none of the accelerations are valid." Conversation exploded as people debated the discovery. Margaret raised her hand for silence. "This is not a guaranteed defense. A judge might interpret the language differently. But it gives us grounds to contest the acceleration in court. That will take time, during which the normal payment schedules remain in effect." Ida Henderson stood, her weathered face thoughtful. "But going to court costs money none of us have, and Blackwood can afford better lawyers than we can." "True," Margaret agreed, "which is why we are not going to court. We are going to negotiate." She turned to Luke. "Tomorrow morning, you and I are going to visit Mr. Blackwood with a proposal. We are going to offer him something he wants more than the satisfaction of destroying the cooperative." Luke's expression shifted to curiosity. "What could we possibly offer that would make him back down?" Margaret smiled grimly. "The one thing Cyrus Blackwood values above all else: money." The meeting with Blackwood the next morning was tense. He received them in his office with cold politeness, clearly expecting them to plead for mercy. Instead, Margaret placed a detailed financial analysis on his desk. "Mr. Blackwood, I have calculated the probable outcome if you pursue acceleration of the cooperative loans. You will win in court because Judge Morrison tends to favor established institutions over newcomers. You will seize assets worth approximately $8,000 at auction prices." She paused to let that sink in. "However, pursuing this course will take 6 to 9 months of legal proceedings. During that time, interest continues to accrue, but no payments will be made, pending resolution. Your legal costs will run approximately $500. The actual auction will realize perhaps 70% of estimated value because distressed sales always discount." Margaret produced a second document. "Net result: you gain approximately $5,000 profit over 18 months, accounting for legal costs, lost interest payments, and auction discounts. Blackwood's expression remained neutral, but his eyes showed interest. "You have an alternative proposal." Margaret slid a third document across the desk. "The cooperative members will make a collective payment of $2,000 within 60 days. In exchange, you will withdraw the acceleration demands and extend the payment schedules by 6 months for all members. This gives you immediate cash, eliminates your legal costs, and maintains the interest income stream for a longer period." She met his calculating gaze. "Net result: you gain approximately $6,000 over 24 months with zero risk and zero effort. More money than forcing bankruptcy, achieved faster without the community resentment that would damage your reputation." Blackwood studied the proposal in silence. When he finally spoke, his tone carried grudging respect. "You have learned to think like a banker, Miss Brennan. Most people in your position would have tried emotional appeals or threats. You are offering me a better business deal. Because this is business, Mr. Blackwood." Margaret kept her voice professional. "You are not evil, and I am not heroic. We both want to maximize our position. I am simply showing you that cooperation achieves that goal better than conflict." Blackwood read through the proposal, carefully checking her mathematics. After several minutes, he nodded. "I accept your terms, but the $2,000 payment must be made within 60 days. "If it is not, the acceleration provisions return to full effect," agreed, Margaret said. They shook hands and left the bank. Outside, Luke let out a breath he had been holding. "Where are we going to get $2,000 in 60 days? Margaret smiled. "We are not going to get it. The cooperative is going to earn it." Over the next 8 weeks, the cooperative operated with intensity that bordered on desperation. Margaret negotiated a special large order with Fort Worth wholesalers purchasing merchandise for spring planting season at maximum discount. The cooperative members sold the supplies to their communities at normal retail prices, splitting the profit margin. Simultaneously, Margaret organized a series of sales and promotions designed to move inventory rapidly. Every cooperative member participated, coordinating their efforts to create a county-wide event that drew customers from as far as 50 miles away. The mathematics worked. By the 60th day, the cooperative had generated $2,140 in collective profit. Margaret made the payment to Blackwood personally, handing him the certified bank draft with quiet satisfaction. He accepted it with a nod. "You have won this round, Miss Brennan." But business is not a single transaction. It is an ongoing relationship. We will work together again, and next time, I will be better prepared for your competence. Margaret heard the warning beneath the professional courtesy. Blackwood would not make the same mistakes again. He would study her methods, anticipate her strategies, and counter them. The conflict was not over, merely postponed, but that was a problem for another day. Today she had saved 8 businesses and proven that cooperation could triumph over consolidation. The wedding took place as scheduled on February 14th in the Red River Church. The building was packed with townspeople who had come to celebrate not just a marriage, but a survival. Margaret wore a simple dress made by Ida Henderson, cream-colored cotton with lace at the collar. Luke wore his only suit, still slightly tight but brushed clean of dust. Reverend Matthews performed the ceremony with warmth and brevity, understanding that frontier couples valued efficiency over elaborate ritual. When Luke placed the ring on Margaret's finger, a simple gold band he had purchased with money from the ranch's first real profit, his hands trembled slightly. "I promise to be a good husband," he said quietly, "to work beside you and build with you and never take for granted what you have given me." Margaret looked into his eyes and saw her future. "I promise to be a good wife, to trust you and challenge you, and never forget that we are stronger together than we could ever be apart." They kissed to applause from the congregation, sealing a partnership that had begun with deception and grown into something infinitely more valuable. Truth forged from lies, hope built on desperation, love emerging slowly from respect and shared purpose. The reception was held in the town hall with food provided by the restaurant owners and music from the same band that had played at the harvest dance. Margaret danced with Luke, with Samuel Briggs, with Wade Cooper, who congratulated her on outwitting Blackwood. She laughed more than she had since leaving Boston, surrounded by people who valued her not for pedigree or social status, but for competence and character. As the evening grew late and guests began departing, Margaret stood on the steps outside the hall with Luke watching people walk into the February night. The town that had been dying when she arrived now showed signs of vibrant life. Lights glowed in windows. Voices carried on the cold air. Children ran between buildings playing games that suggested security and hope. "You did this," Luke said quietly. "You saved this place." Margaret shook her head. "We did this. You gave me the opportunity. They gave me the trust. I just did what I was always good at, organizing numbers and finding solutions." Luke pulled her close against the cold. "You did more than organize numbers, Margaret. You gave people reason to believe in themselves. That is worth more than all the accounting in the world." The wordless understanding that had built between them over months of partnership wrapped around them like a blanket. Two people who had found in each other what they had not known they were searching for. Margaret Brennan had come to Texas looking for Daniel Thorne, a fiction created by a con artist. Instead, she had found Luke Garrett, a reality more valuable than any fantasy could have been, and together they had built something that would last long after the lies that brought them together had been forgotten. The months between their February wedding and the warm April morning, when everything changed, passed in contented routine. Margaret managed the cooperative while Luke worked the ranch. They were building not just a business but a life filling the main house with small touches that transformed it from shelter to home. Curtains sewn by Ida Henderson. A rocking chair Luke crafted during winter evenings. Books ordered from Fort Worth that lined shelves in what had become Margaret's office. Spring came to Red River County with the kind of warmth that promised renewal. The winter wheat pushed green shoots through dark soil. Cattle that had survived the cold months grew sleek on new grass. The town itself seemed to straighten its shoulders, shaking off years of decline with the confidence that comes from surviving against odds. Margaret Garrett, no longer Brennan, stood in the doorway of the ranch house and watched her husband work with a young colt in the breaking corral. 4 months of marriage had taught her the rhythms of his movement, the patience in his approach, the quiet competence he brought to everything he touched. She had learned to read his silences, to distinguish between peaceful quiet and troubled thought. This morning, his silence held weight. She walked across the yard, her boots stirring dust that would turn to mud when the spring rains came. The cooperative ledgers were balanced. The ranch accounts showed steady profit. They had made the March payment to Blackwood's bank 3 days early. By every measurable standard, they were succeeding. But something was wrong. Luke glanced up as she approached, his face showing concern he had not yet voiced. "We need to talk about Red River." Margaret leaned against the corral fence. "What about Red River?" Luke secured the colt to the hitching post and walked over, removing his hat to wipe sweat from his forehead despite the cool morning air. "The railroad is coming." Margaret felt her stomach drop. The railroad had been rumored for 2 years, but surveys and proposals had gone nowhere. Most people had stopped believing it would actually happen. "When construction starts in June. I heard it from Tom Bradley this morning. He was in Fort Worth last week and saw the maps. The line will run from Fort Worth to Amarillo, passing 15 miles south of Red River. 15 miles, close enough to bring opportunity, far enough to kill the town unless they adapted." Margaret's mind immediately began calculating implications. 15 miles means Red River stops being a natural stopping point for travelers. The mail coach route will change. Commercial traffic will follow the rail line. Everything that made this town viable will shift south. Luke nodded grimly. Blackwood knows. Bradley says the bank already purchased land where their rail station will be. Blackwood is planning a new town complete with hotel stores and warehouses. He will move his bank headquarters there within a year. And Red River will die. Margaret finished quietly. Everyone who can move will follow the railroad. Those who cannot move will be left in a ghost town with no commerce, no services, no future. They stood wordlessly, the implications spreading like ink through water. The cooperative had saved businesses for 6 months. But what good was saving something that would be destroyed by forces beyond anyone's control? Margaret thought of Samuel Briggs, who had worked 30 years to build his store, of Ida Henderson, whose boarding house had been her sole income since her husband died, of the families who had invested everything in Red River, believing it had a future. "How long before people know?" she asked. "Bradley is telling folks today. By tonight, everyone in the county will have heard." Margaret straightened her shoulders, that familiar resolve rising despite the magnitude of the challenge. "Then we need to call an emergency meeting. Tonight. Every cooperative member and anyone else who wants to attend." Luke studied her face. "You have an idea." "I have the beginning of an idea," Margaret corrected. "Whether it is a good idea or a catastrophically bad one, I will not know until I work through the mathematics." She spent the afternoon in the ranch office covering paper with calculations and projections. Luke brought her coffee and sandwiches she barely touched, working through numbers with the focused intensity that had once impressed her Boston supervisors. The problem was clear. Red River's location had made it valuable. When the railroad changed that location advantage, the town lost its reason to exist. Businesses could not survive without travelers and freight traffic. Families would leave when jobs disappeared. The cycle of decline would accelerate until nothing remained but empty buildings and memories. But what if they did not fight the railroad? What if they used it? By the time Margaret arrived at the church that evening, the pews were packed with worried faces. News of the railroad had spread exactly as Luke predicted, and fear hung in the air like smoke. She could see it in the slumped shoulders, the anxious whispers, the expressions of people contemplating the collapse of everything they had built. Cyrus Blackwood sat in his usual front pew, looking composed and unconcerned. Of course he was unconcerned. He had already positioned himself to profit from the change. He would abandon Red River without hesitation, taking his capital to the new rail town and leaving others to manage the wreckage. Reverend Matthews called the meeting to order, his normally cheerful voice subdued. "I think we all know why we are here. The railroad is coming, and it appears Red River is not on the route. Mrs. Garrett has asked to address the community. Margaret, the floor is yours." Margaret stood and walked to the front, carrying her papers and her half-formed plan. She looked at the faces before her, these people who had trusted her once and might trust her again if she could offer them hope grounded in reality rather than false comfort. "The railroad is coming," she began without preamble. "It will pass 15 miles south of Red River. Within a year, most commercial traffic will follow the rail line. The mail coach will reroute. Travelers will stop at the new rail town instead of here. Red River will lose the advantages that have sustained it for 12 years. She paused, letting them absorb what they already knew. These are facts, and denying them serves no purpose. The question is not whether Red River will change. The question is whether we manage that change or surrender to it. Samuel Briggs raised his hand. "Mrs. Garrett, I do not see how we manage this. My store depends on travelers and freight customers. If they stop coming, I have no business. Moving to the rail town would cost more than I have. Staying here means slow death." Margaret nodded. "You are correct that staying as we are means failure. But what if we do not stay as we are? What if Red River becomes something different?" She unrolled a large paper showing the rail line map she had copied. "The new rail town will focus on through traffic. Travelers waiting for connections, freight transfers, commercial traffic moving quickly from one place to another. That is one kind of town with one kind of opportunity." She pointed to Red River's location. "We are 15 miles from the rail line, true, but we are also situated in the center of the best grazing land in the county. We have water from the river. We have established ranches and farms surrounding us. What if Red River becomes the agricultural center that supports the rail town?" Wade Cooper leaned forward, his skepticism evident. "What does that mean in practical terms, Mrs. Garrett?" "It means we stop trying to serve travelers and start serving ranchers," Margaret explained. "The rail town will need beef, wheat, vegetables, wool, leather, all the agricultural products this region produces. But ranchers 15 or 20 miles out will not want to drive their cattle or haul their crops to the rail station for every transaction. They will want a closer market where they can consolidate shipments." She met Cooper's gaze. "Red River can be that market. We become the collection point where ranchers sell their products, where those products are prepared for rail shipment, where buyers can come to negotiate contracts without traveling to every individual ranch." Ida Henderson spoke up. "That sounds promising in theory, Mrs. Garrett. But how do we make such a transformation? We do not have the facilities for processing or storage. We do not have the capital to build them." Margaret had anticipated this question. "The cooperative has generated approximately $3,000 in collective savings over the past 6 months. That is not enough to build everything we need, but it is enough to start. We build a single large warehouse and stockyard complex. Cooperative members invest in it jointly. We negotiate with the railroad for reduced shipping rates on consolidated freight." She continued before anyone could interrupt. "The individual stores remain serving local needs. But we add the collective facility that makes Red River valuable to the rail economy instead of obsolete because of it. Ranchers sell to us. We process, package, and ship via the railroad. The rail town handles passenger traffic. We handle agricultural commerce. Both towns succeed by specializing rather than competing." Cyrus Blackwood stood his movement commanding immediate attention. "Mrs. Garrett's vision is admirable but impractical. Building such a facility requires far more than $3,000. More importantly, it requires expertise in rail freight contracts, warehouse management, and livestock processing that no one in this room possesses. You would be investing everything in an enterprise you do not know how to operate." His tone was reasonable, even concerned. "I have offered to purchase businesses from those who wish to relocate to the rail town. That remains the safest option. Take the capital you have built through the cooperative and invest it in the new town where the railroad guarantees success. Gambling on an unproven agricultural market is unnecessarily risky." Margaret had expected this argument. "Mr. Blackwood, you are correct that building and operating such a facility requires expertise we currently lack. That is why I have spent the afternoon writing to contacts in Fort Worth and Kansas City who do possess that expertise." She produced letters she had drafted. "These are inquiries to agricultural merchants and freight managers asking if they would be interested in a partnership arrangement. We provide the land, the local relationships, and the initial capital. They provide the technical knowledge and connections to Eastern markets. We split the profits according to investment and contribution." Blackwood's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "You are proposing to bring in outside investors." "I am proposing to seek partners who can teach us what we need to know," Margaret corrected. "The same way Luke taught me to work a ranch and I taught cooperative members to manage accounts. We do not need to possess all expertise ourselves. We need to be wise enough to find it and confident enough to learn from it." Conversation rippled through the crowd as people debated the merits. Margaret let them talk, watching their faces as fear slowly gave way to cautious hope. She was not offering certainty. She was offering the possibility of survival through adaptation. Finally, Reverend Matthews called for order. "This is a decision that cannot be made tonight. Mrs. Garrett has given us much to consider. I propose we adjourn and reconvene in 3 days, giving everyone time to think and discuss with their families." The meeting ended with more questions than answers, but Margaret saw something in people's expressions that had not been there at the start. Not confidence, not yet, but the beginning of belief that maybe possibly they did not have to simply accept defeat. Luke walked beside her as they left the church, his hand finding hers in the darkness. "That was either brilliant or insane," he observed quietly. "Probably both," Margaret admitted. "But doing nothing is definitely insane, so we might as well try brilliant and see what happens." Over the next 3 days, Margaret worked 18-hour days drafting proposals, calculating projections, and responding to the letters that began arriving from Fort Worth contacts. The challenge was even larger than she had initially estimated. Building adequate warehouse and stockyard facilities would cost closer to $8,000, not the $5,000 she had hoped. Operating expenses would run $300 monthly until the business generated self-sustaining revenue. But the responses from potential partners were encouraging. 2 agricultural merchants expressed serious interest in a joint venture. A freight manager from Kansas City offered to visit Red River in June to assess the opportunity. The pieces of the plan were falling into place, assuming the community was willing to take the risk. The second meeting was even more crowded than the first. Word had spread beyond cooperative members to include every rancher and business owner in the county. People stood along the walls when the pews filled. The atmosphere crackled with tension. Margaret presented her refined proposal, including the realistic cost estimates and partnership opportunities. She showed projections for revenue based on current agricultural production in the county. She explained the risk, clearly hiding nothing about what could go wrong. When she finished, silence held for a long moment. Then Wade Cooper stood. "Mrs. Garrett, I have thought about little else these past 3 days. My ranch produces approximately $3,000 worth of beef annually. Currently, I drive cattle to Fort Worth twice a year, losing 2 weeks of work each time, plus the cost of hired hands for the drive. If I could sell locally and have my beef shipped by rail, I would save time and money while increasing the number of cattle I could manage." He looked around at the other ranchers. "I am prepared to invest $1,000 in this venture. Not because I trust Mrs. Garrett's accounting, though I do, but because I trust that doing nothing means certain failure, while doing something means possible success. I choose possible over certain." Samuel Briggs rose next. "The general store will invest $500. It is half of everything I have managed to save, but Mrs. Garrett is correct. We must adapt or die." One by one, others stood and pledged amounts. Ida Henderson offered $300. Jacob Walsh, the blacksmith, committed $400. Even smaller contributions came from families with limited resources but unlimited determination not to watch their town disappear. By the end of the evening, they had commitments totaling $6,800. Not quite enough, but close. Close enough that Margaret felt the plan might actually work. Then Cyrus Blackwood stood. The room fell silent. Blackwood commanded attention through sheer force of financial power. When he spoke, his words carried weight that could make or break the entire enterprise. "Mrs. Garrett, you have convinced this community to gamble their savings on an unproven venture. That takes either remarkable courage or remarkable recklessness. I am not certain which." He paused, his cold eyes studying her face. "However, I am a banker. I evaluate risk professionally, and I believe your risk assessment is sound. The agricultural market you describe has genuine potential. The railroad connection provides infrastructure. The local relationships provide competitive advantage." Blackwood withdrew a document from his coat. "Therefore, Red River Bank will provide a loan of $5,000 at 12% interest secured by the warehouse and stockyard facilities. This will give you adequate capital to build properly rather than cutting corners due to insufficient funds." Margaret felt tension coil in her shoulders. Blackwood was not offering charity. He was inserting himself into the venture, ensuring that if it succeeded, he would profit, and if it failed, he would own the assets. It was a business decision calculated to maximize his advantage regardless of outcome. But it was also exactly what they needed. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood," Margaret said carefully. "We accept your loan offer. However, I would like to negotiate the interest rate. 10% is more standard for secured commercial loans." Blackwood's expression shifted to mild surprise. "You wish to negotiate with me, Mrs. Garrett? I wish to ensure fair terms for both parties, Mr. Blackwood. You will be adequately compensated at 10%. 12% is excessive given the asset security." For a long moment they stared at each other across the crowded church. Then Blackwood smiled slightly. 10.5%. Final offer." "Agreed," Margaret said, extending her hand. They shook, sealing an agreement that bound the community to Blackwood's bank, but also provided the resources necessary for the plan to work. It was a compromise, neither side getting everything they wanted, but both sides getting enough. Construction began in late April. The site selected was on the western edge of Red River, where the land was flat and accessible to the road that would connect to the new rail town. Luke supervised the building crews with the same patient competence he brought to horse training. Margaret managed the finances and coordinated with the Fort Worth partners who agreed to provide technical guidance. The work was harder than anyone anticipated. Spring rains turned the construction site into a mud pit. Materials arrived late or damaged. Costs overran initial estimates by 15%, requiring additional community investment. Tensions flared as the project consumed everyone's time and energy without yet producing any revenue. By early June, when the railroad construction crews arrived 15 miles south, the Red River warehouse was only half finished. The stockyards had adequate fencing, but lacked loading chutes and sorting pens. The business was behind schedule and over budget, exactly the situation that caused most ventures to fail. Margaret stood in the unfinished warehouse one evening in mid-June, surrounded by unpainted walls and incomplete flooring, and wondered if she had led the entire community into disaster. She had been so confident in her calculations, so certain the mathematics would work. But mathematics assumed competent execution, and they were struggling with every aspect of the physical construction. Luke found her there as the sun set, sitting on a stack of lumber with her ledger open but untouched. He sat beside her, and for a moment they simply existed together in the silence. Finally, Margaret spoke. "What if I was wrong, Luke? What if I convinced everyone to invest in something that cannot succeed? What if I destroyed the community instead of saving it?" Luke was quiet for a moment, then pointed toward the eastern wall, where a frame was partially erected. "See that corner post? I set it 3 times because the ground kept settling wrong. Each time I thought maybe I had made a mistake in my measurements, that maybe the whole structure was flawed. But the problem was not the design. It was the ground. Once I reinforced the foundation properly, the post held firm." He turned to look at her, his eyes holding steady. "You designed this right, Margaret. The mathematics work. We are just working through the difficulty of building something new on uncertain ground. That does not mean the design is flawed. It means we need to reinforce our foundation and keep building." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. She had not cried since arriving in Texas, pride and necessity keeping emotions locked away. But Luke's quiet confidence in her, his unwavering belief that the plan would work, touched something deep that pride could not protect. "I am afraid," she admitted quietly. "I am afraid that everyone trusted me, and I will fail them." Luke put his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "Then we fail together. That is what partners do. But I do not think we are going to fail Margaret. I think we are going to succeed because we refuse to quit. Just like you refused to quit when you arrived here. Just like this community refused to quit when the railroad bypassed us." The warehouse was completed in August. The stockyards opened for business on September 1st with a ceremony attended by every family in Red River County. The first cattle sale happened 3 days later when Wade Cooper delivered 50 head of prime beef. The Fort Worth partner Margaret had recruited a man named James Morrison, evaluated the cattle, negotiated a price, and arranged rail shipment within 4 hours. Cooper received his payment in cash the same day. He stood in the warehouse office counting the bills with an expression of wonder. "I just sold 50 cattle without a 2-week trail drive, without hiring extra hands, without losing weight off the animals from the journey. This actually works." Word spread quickly. Other ranchers brought cattle. Farmers arrived with wheat and corn. The warehouse processed and shipped products with efficiency that impressed even the railroad freight managers. Within 6 weeks, the facility was operating at 30% capacity and generating modest profit. But the real test came in October when a rancher from 40 miles away arrived with 200 head of cattle. His name was Thomas Brennan, no relation to Margaret, despite the shared surname, and he had heard about the Red River operation from other ranchers. "I have been driving cattle to Fort Worth twice a year for 15 years, Brennan explained to Margaret. "Losing 2 weeks each trip plus hiring 5 hands at $2 each per day. If you can offer competitive prices and reliable rail shipping, you will have my business permanently." Margaret evaluated his cattle, consulted with Morrison, and offered a price 5% higher than Brennan would have received in Fort Worth after accounting for his drive costs. Brennan accepted immediately. That sale marked a turning point. If ranchers 40 miles away found Red River more valuable than Fort Worth, the business model was validated. The warehouse was not just serving the local community, it was becoming a regional hub exactly as Margaret had envisioned. By December, the facility operated at 60% capacity. The community investments were generating returns. The bank loan payments were made on schedule. Businesses that had been dying 9 months earlier were not just surviving, but growing. Red River had transformed itself from a dying frontier town into a thriving agricultural market. The changes were visible everywhere. Samuel Briggs expanded his general store, adding a section specifically for ranching supplies. Ida Henderson renovated the boarding house, anticipating merchants and buyers who would need lodging while conducting business in Red River. The church received not just paint, but a new bell, funded by donations from people who finally had surplus income. Even Cyrus Blackwood acknowledged the success. He encountered Margaret at the bank one morning in early December, his expression showing grudging respect. "You have proven me wrong, Mrs. Garrett. I believed Red River would die when the railroad bypassed us. Instead, you transformed it into something more valuable than it was before." "We transformed it," Margaret corrected. "You provided the capital that made it possible. The community provided the labor and the trust. I simply organized the mathematics and showed people what was possible." Blackwood nodded slowly. "I have learned something from watching you work these past 9 months. I have spent my career believing that consolidation and control were the paths to success. You have shown me that distribution and cooperation can be equally powerful, perhaps more powerful given the loyalty they generate." He extended his hand. "I would like to propose a new relationship, Mrs. Garrett, not adversaries competing for advantage, but partners working toward mutual success. Red River's growth benefits the bank. The bank's capital can accelerate Red River's development. We could accomplish more together than in opposition." Margaret studied his hand for a long moment before accepting the handshake. "I am willing to try partnership, Mr. Blackwood, but understand that for me partnership means transparency and fair dealing, not manipulation or hidden advantage." "Understood," Blackwood said, "and I will hold you to the same standard." Christmas that year was the first truly joyous celebration Red River had experienced in 5 years. The town hall was decorated with pine boughs and candles. Every family contributed food to a communal feast. Children performed a nativity play, while their parents watched with the contentment that comes from security and hope. Margaret sat with Luke at a long table surrounded by the people who had trusted her enough to risk everything on her ideas. Samuel Briggs told stories about his early years in Red River. Ida Henderson shared memories of her late husband. Wade Cooper argued good-naturedly with other ranchers about whose cattle would command the highest prices next spring. As the evening grew late and people began departing into the cold December night, Margaret found herself standing outside the hall with Luke, watching families walk home through streets lit by starlight and the warm glow from windows. "Do you ever regret it?" Luke asked quietly. Giving up Boston for this, Margaret considered the question seriously. There were things about Boston she missed: the libraries, the concerts, the sophisticated restaurants, the ability to walk down a street and disappear into anonymity rather than being known by everyone. But those were small losses compared to what she had gained. "I regret nothing," she said finally. "Boston taught me skills. Texas taught me purpose. I would rather have purpose than comfort." Luke pulled her close against the cold. "You gave me purpose too, Margaret. I was just surviving before you arrived. Now I am living." They walked back to where their horses were tied, two people who had found in each other the courage to build lives worth living. Behind them, Red River glowed with the warm light of windows and hearths, a community that had chosen survival over surrender. The ranch house was dark when they arrived, but Margaret lit lamps while Luke tended the horses. She sat at her desk and opened the ledger that documented their progress. 9 months ago, this page had been nearly empty, showing only debt and decline. Now it recorded steady profit-growing equity, a future that extended beyond mere survival into genuine prosperity. Luke came in from the barn bringing cold air and the scent of horses. He stood behind her chair, his hand resting on her shoulder, while she wrote the final entries for December. "Good year," he observed. Margaret closed the ledger and turned to face him. "Good year, and next year will be better." "Because we will make it better," Luke said. "Together." "Together," Margaret echoed. It was a promise they would spend the next 40 years keeping. The spring of 1885 brought Margaret's first child. Daniel Garrett was born on a warm May morning with Luke pacing outside the bedroom while Ida Henderson and the doctor attended the birth. When Margaret finally placed the tiny bundle in Luke's arms, his weathered face transformed with wonder. "Named for the man who never existed," Margaret said softly, her voice hoarse from labor, "but who brought us together anyway." Luke touched his son's impossibly small hand, marveling at fingers no thicker than matchsticks. Daniel Garrett will be very real, and he will know the truth of how his parents met. The baby stirred eyes opening to reveal the same creekwater blue as his father's. Luke felt his throat tighten with emotions he had thought buried forever with Anna and baby Rose. This was not replacement. This was renewal, a second chance he had never expected to receive. Margaret watched her husband cradle their son with surprising gentleness for such large work-roughened hands. She had built many things in the 2 years since arriving in Texas: a solvent ranch, a thriving cooperative, a transformed community. But this, she thought, was the foundation for everything else. Family. Check. 10 years flowed past like the Red River after spring rain each season, bringing growth and change. By 1895, 3 children filled the ranch house with the particular chaos that comes from young lives lived at full volume. Daniel, at 10, was already showing Margaret's affinity for numbers, keeping a meticulous ledger of his chores and the pennies Luke paid him for work beyond his regular duties. He could calculate profit margins in his head and had begun helping his mother with the simpler cooperative accounts, his careful handwriting filling practice ledgers with neat columns. Rose, named for the daughter Luke had lost, was 7 and possessed her father's instinctive understanding of animals. She could gentle a skittish horse with soft words and patient hands, moving around the corral with confidence that made grown ranch hands shake their heads in admiration. Already she talked about breeding her own line of horses someday, crosses that would combine speed with endurance. Thomas, barely 4, followed his older siblings everywhere with the determined steps of a child who refused to be left behind. Too young yet for defined talents, he showed flashes of both parents. His mother's stubbornness when told he could not do something, his father's quiet observation before attempting new tasks. The T-Bar Ranch had grown considerably. 180 horses now grazed the expanded pastures. 120 cattle bore the T-Bar brand. Luke had hired 2 permanent ranch hands and took on seasonal workers during busy periods. The debt to Blackwood's bank had been paid in full 3 years earlier, the final payment celebrated with a small party where even the banker himself had raised a glass to their success. The Red River warehouse processed over $40,000 in agricultural products annually, making it one of the largest operations between Fort Worth and Amarillo. The cooperative had evolved beyond simple purchasing into a complex network of shared resources, equipment loans, and collective marketing that benefited everyone involved. Margaret taught accounting twice a week at the church, training other women in skills that had once been considered inappropriate for ladies. Her students included ranchers' wives who wanted to understand their family finances, shopkeepers' daughters preparing to inherit businesses, and young women who simply wanted knowledge that might provide independence someday. Luke stood straighter now than he had in the dark years after Anna's death. The weight of grief and isolation had finally lifted, replaced by the purposeful contentment of a man who knew his life mattered. He taught his children to ride to rope, to respect the land that sustained them. In the evenings, he would sit on the porch with Margaret, watching their children play in the yard where she had once stood alone and desperate, and feel gratitude that sometimes bordered on disbelief. "Remember when you had 43 cents, he would say, shaking his head in wonder at how far they had traveled from that starting point. "I remember thinking I had nothing," Margaret would reply, watching Daniel help Thomas climb onto the porch railing while Rose supervised with bossy concern. "I did not yet understand that sometimes you have to lose everything to find what actually matters." Their 25th anniversary in 1910 brought the entire county to celebrate. The church could not hold the crowd, so tables were set up in the town square under a sky so blue it seemed to have been painted specifically for the occasion. Streamers hung between buildings. A 3-piece band played music that ranged from church hymns to lively dance tunes. Samuel Briggs, now 70 and finally retired after selling his store to his nephew, made a speech about the Boston woman who had saved Red River. His voice cracked with emotion as he described the day Margaret had first walked into his failing store and offered hope instead of pity. Wade Cooper, his hair gone white but his back still straight, told stories about teaching the greenhorn accountant to ride a horse. He embellished shamelessly, making Margaret's early attempts at ranch work sound far more comical than they had actually been, but the affection beneath the teasing was genuine. Even Cyrus Blackwood, who had become an unlikely friend over the years, offered a toast. To Margaret Garrett, who taught an old banker that profit and principle need not be opposites. May Red River County continue to prosper from her wisdom for another 25 years at least. Margaret and Luke danced as they had at the harvest dance 25 years before moving with the practiced ease of partners who knew each other's rhythms perfectly. Their children were grown now and standing at the edges of the crowd watching. Daniel, at 30, managed the warehouse with the same precise attention to detail his mother brought to every undertaking. He had married a Fort Worth woman named Elizabeth who shared his head for business, and together they were expanding warehouse operations to include direct contracts with Eastern buyers. Rose had married a rancher from the next county, a quiet man named James who understood that his wife knew more about horses than most men would learn in a lifetime. They were raising their own family on land that adjoined the T-Bar and Rose-bred horses that sold for premium prices across 3 states. Thomas worked the T-Bar ranch alongside his aging father, learning the rhythms of land and livestock that could only be understood through years of daily attention. At 24, he showed no interest in leaving content to build on the foundation his parents had established. 40 years ago, I was alone in Boston, unemployed and desperate, Margaret said as they danced. If someone had told me I would build this life, I would not have believed them. Luke pulled her closer, his embrace still strong despite the gray in his hair and the lines that marked 64 years of living. 40 years ago, I was alone here, convinced my life was over at 30. Neither of us knew what we were capable of until we had no choice but to find out. Margaret looked around at the celebration at the thriving town that had been dying when she arrived at the children and grandchildren who represented a future she had built from nothing. The deception that brought me here was cruel, she said quietly, but I cannot regret it, not when it led to this. Luke understood. He had felt the same about Anna's death for many years, guilty for finding happiness again, as though joy somehow dishonored her memory. But time and Margaret's patient wisdom had taught him that life was meant to be lived forward, not frozen in grief. Anna would have liked you, he said, speaking of his first wife, without pain for perhaps the first time. She valued competence and courage. You have both in abundance. I wish I could have known her, Margaret replied honestly. She made you the man you are. I built on the foundation she helped create. They danced without speaking for a while, the music washing over them, the celebration continuing around them. 25 years of partnership, of challenges faced and overcome, of small daily kindnesses that accumulated into love deeper than passion's first fire. To another 25, Luke said quietly, though both of them knew that time was not guaranteed at their ages, to however many we get, Margaret countered, and making them count. Luke Garrett died peacefully in the spring of 1924 at age 74 in the bed he had shared with Margaret for 40 years. The end came gently after a brief illness that seemed less like sickness and more like his body simply deciding it had worked long enough. His last words were characteristically brief. Good partnership. Margaret held his hand as his breathing slowed and stopped her thumb tracing the familiar calluses that decades of labor had etched into his palm. She did not cry. Tears seemed inadequate for grief this deep and love this enduring. Instead, she sat beside him in the silence they had shared for 4 decades, saying goodbye to the man who had given her a chance when no one else would, who had taught her that strength and gentleness were not opposites, who had built beside her rather than for her. The funeral filled the church to overflowing. 3 generations of Garretts attended along with what seemed like half the county. People stood outside in the spring sunshine, listening to Reverend Williams through open windows as he spoke of a man who had lived with quiet dignity and partnered with wisdom. They buried him on a hill overlooking the T-Bar Ranch, where he could see the land he had tended and the buildings he had helped restore. Margaret stood between Daniel and Rose during the service, Thomas on her other side, and felt the support of the family they had created together. She lived 6 more years, dying at age 73, in the same bed surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried forward the legacy she and Luke had built. Her mind remained sharp until the end, still calculating profit margins and suggesting business improvements when Daniel brought warehouse accounts for her review. Her last words were directed at a great-granddaughter who bore her name, a serious child of 8, who showed early promise with numbers. Never let anyone tell you that competence has a gender, young Margaret. Numbers do not care who counts them. Neither should anyone else. They buried her beside Luke on the hill, their headstones simple and practical, marked only with names and dates, and a single shared inscription suggested by Daniel. Partners in all things. Together they built what neither could have achieved alone. The year was 1931. Daniel Garrett, now 61, and silver-haired, stood in the Red River warehouse his mother had designed and his parents had built. Around him, 8 grandchildren and 4 great-grandchildren gathered for the annual family meeting that had become tradition, a gathering held each year on the anniversary of Margaret's arrival in Texas. The warehouse had grown since Margaret's time. 3 additional buildings now housed processing equipment, cold storage, and administrative offices. The operation employed 42 people year-round and twice that during harvest season. But the original building still stood, its foundation solid, its purpose unchanged. Daniel lifted a small wooden box from the warehouse safe. Inside, preserved with careful attention, lay 6 leather-bound accounting ledgers. The pages yellowed, but the numbers, still clear, written in his mother's precise hand. "Your great-grandmother arrived in Texas with exactly these," Daniel said, opening the first ledger to show Henderson Textiles' careful accounts. 43 cents in her pocket, and 6 books full of numbers that Boston said were worthless. The youngest great-grandchild, a girl of 7 named Margaret, after her ancestor, raised her hand with the solemnity of youth. But she was rich, Grandpa Daniel. Everyone knows that. Daniel smiled. Not in the way most people understand wealth. She had knowledge. She had determination. She had the courage to risk everything when she had nothing left to lose. He gestured toward the warehouse around them, toward the thriving town of Red River, visible through the windows, toward the T-Bar Ranch that had grown into one of the largest operations in the county. All of this began with 43 cents and 6 accounting ledgers. Not because money and books built it, but because one woman refused to accept defeat, because one man had the wisdom to recognize competence when he saw it, because 2 people chose partnership over pride. He ran his hand over the ledger's worn cover. They showed us that sometimes the worst deceptions lead to the greatest truths, that sometimes the person you are looking for was never the one you needed, and that sometimes if you are brave enough to risk everything, you find that you had the fortune you needed all along. Daniel looked around at the faces watching him. 3 generations who had never known poverty or desperation, who had grown up with security and opportunity that Margaret and Luke had built from nothing. It was his responsibility to ensure they understood that foundation, that they recognized the courage and sacrifice that made their comfortable lives possible. Your great-grandmother came to Texas seeking Daniel Thorne, who never existed. Instead, she found herself, and in finding herself, she built something that will last forever. He carefully returned the ledgers to their box. Every year we gather to remember, not because the past matters more than the present, but because understanding where we came from helps us know where we should go. Young Margaret raised her hand again. What happened to the 43 cents? Grandpa Daniel smiled. Your great-grandmother kept them, 3 coins in a small cloth bag. She said they reminded her that fortune is not measured in money, but in what you do with whatever you have. He reached into his vest pocket and withdrew that same cloth bag, the fabric worn thin by decades of handling. These coins have been passed down through our family. Someday they will be yours to keep. And you will tell your children and grandchildren the story of how Margaret Brennan came to Texas with nothing and built everything. The family stood in the warehouse that still bore signs of Margaret's influence. Her office remained preserved on the second floor of the desk, where she had calculated countless projections still holding a place of honor. The accounting methods she had developed were still taught to new employees. The partnership principles she had championed still guided business decisions. Outside, the Texas sun shone on land that had tested and shaped generations. Red River had grown into a prosperous town of 2,000 residents. The railroad that had once threatened to kill it now served it, bringing buyers to the warehouse and carrying away products to eastern markets. The cooperative that Margaret had founded still operated, though it had evolved into a formal agricultural exchange with members across 3 counties. The T-Bar Ranch still bore the brand that Marcus Thornton had established, but that Margaret and Luke had restored. 4 generations of Garretts had worked that land, each adding to what came before, each building on foundations laid in desperation and hope. As the family meeting concluded and children scattered to explore the warehouse, Daniel stood alone in the office his mother had used. He could still picture her there, bent over ledgers by lamplight, calculating pathways out of problems that seemed unsolvable. She had been 50 when he last saw her there, still working daily, despite his protests that she had earned rest. "Rest is for people who have not found their purpose," she had told him. "I know mine. This is where I belong." Daniel understood now what he had not fully grasped then. Margaret had not just built a business or saved a town. She had proven that one person armed with competence and courage could transform everything, that gender meant nothing in the face of determination, that partnerships built on respect could achieve what individuals never could alone. He locked the office and descended the stairs, joining his family as they prepared to walk to the church for the memorial service that always followed the family meeting. The service would celebrate both Margaret and Luke, honoring the partnership that had shaped Red River County's destiny. As they walked through town, Daniel noted the evidence of his parents' legacy everywhere. Briggs General Store, now run by the 3rd generation of that family. Henderson House, the boarding house Ida had left to her niece, who maintained the same welcoming standards. The Red River Bank, still operated by the Blackwood family, but with policies that reflected Margaret's influence toward community investment rather than exploitation. The church was full when they arrived, filled with families whose prosperity traced back in some way to decisions Margaret and Luke had made decades earlier. The service was simple, as they had always preferred. Hymns they had loved, readings from Scripture they had found meaningful, testimonials from those whose lives they had touched. And at the end, as tradition dictated, Daniel stood and repeated the story one more time. The story of a woman with 43 cents and 6 ledgers. Of a man who gave her a chance when logic said he should not. Of a partnership that began with deception and grew into truth. The story that proved fortune was measured not in dollars, but in courage. As the sun set over Red River that evening, the Garrett family gathered one final time on the hill where Margaret and Luke rested side by side. The children placed wildflowers on the graves, a tradition started by Rose and continued by each generation. Young Margaret, serious beyond her 7 years, stood before her namesake's headstone and spoke words she had rehearsed all day. "Great Grandma Margaret, I will remember. I will be brave. I will count numbers and help people and build good things." Daniel felt his throat tighten. The legacy would continue, not because he demanded it, but because the example had been set. His mother and father had shown the way. Now it was up to their descendants to walk it. As darkness fell and stars appeared over the Texas prairie, the family descended the hill toward homes and futures built on foundations laid long ago. Behind them, 2 simple headstones marked the resting place of partners who had transformed 43 cents into a fortune that would outlast them all. Margaret Brennan had come to Texas seeking a home. She had found instead the strength to build one, and in building it she had discovered the truth that would sustain generations. The greatest journeys do not take us where we plan to go. They take us where we need to be. And sometimes, if we are very fortunate and very brave, they take us home. The end.